A particular lecture, excuse me, I remember from being in undergraduate college in New Delhi concerned the difference between Gandhi's ways and ours. The speaker, an eminent scholar and journalist, illustrated the difference between what Gandhi did or what Gandhi would do and what he or others of my generation would do through an example of a woman who came up to Gandhi during one of the meetings that Gandhi was holding and said to him, "Gandhiji, you are so good. This child of mine, he just always eats sweets. And I keep telling him to stop eating sweets, and he never stops. He's got this addiction to things that are sweet." I think I might have been that child. Can you just say to him, "Son, stop eating sweets"? Because if you say it, he will listen. And Gandhi looked at her, and he looked at the child, and he said, "Can you come back tomorrow?" So this woman came back tomorrow with her child to the meeting and sat in the audience for about 3 hours. And at the end of the meeting, when everybody had expressed what they wanted Gandhi to do, she went back to him and said, "Gandhiji, I'm back as you said. Can you please tell my child not to eat sweets?" And Gandhi took a deep sigh and looked at the child and looked at the woman and said, "Can you come back tomorrow?" And so she came back tomorrow. And the same thing happened, and at the end of the meeting, Gandhi looked at the child and said, "Son, can you please stop eating sweets? They're not good for you." And this woman says, "Gandhiji, you could have done it on the first day. I came twice and wasted the whole day just for you to say this." And he said, "Well, yes, I could have said it on the first day, but the first day I was also eating sweets. And I couldn't say to him to stop doing what I was doing." So contrast what Gandhi chose to say and do, the strict relationship he drew between his words and actions with statements by today's leaders such as "do as we say, not as we do," from Newt Gingrich to leaders of multilateral financial institutions in Washington, D.C., that tell developing countries that what they should do should be fiscally responsible, not as developed countries themselves might do. So why is it important to draw this distinction in the context of yesterday's talk and today's symposium? Well, for one, it seems to me that the conceptual architecture of the talk hinges on the distinction that Western moral philosophy draws between the moral duties of the individual or the private individual and the public institutions or public agencies, and which is also analogous, or which is also maps on to the distinction between the duty of justice and the duty of goodness. What does this distinction stand for in the moral philosophy that Professor Broom uses, and why is it important to make this distinction? Or to put it another way, what would happen to the architecture of the argument if one could not make this distinction, or if one tried to undermine this distinction, and instead had to rely only on the consequences of the acts of agents, whether they were individual agents or governments? So in my view, obviously, a substantial part of the argument turns on this distinction, although not all of it, between the duty of goodness and the duty of justice. The argument that the duty of goodness is owed not to individuals but to people, and in contrast, the duty of justice is owed to particular individuals and individual rather than to collectives. And the mapping of specific actions to either the duty of goodness, to either the duty of goodness or to the duty of justice. So I want to examine these distinctions and the attribution of the duty of goodness and justice to groups versus individuals, and the mapping of specific actions to one or another sort of duty. But as importantly, or perhaps more importantly, I want to connect the practical proposals that Professor Broom advances, or that he does not view as reasonable or as sufficiently effective, as also how the distinction he draws doesn't allow him to examine other kinds of climate actions. And so I want to talk about three different consequences in terms of the practical implications of that distinction. One around the concrete actions that he sees as not being effective, the second that he sees as being effective, and the third that he does not examine. So at the abstract level, I think I want to talk about these three things. One, the idea that the duty of justice only enjoins against harms to individual persons. The second, that individual agents do not owe duties of goodness to particular persons. And third, the relationship between a particular act and knowledge about that act and the duty of goodness versus duty of justice. And I should say that, I think I said already, I'm not a moral philosopher. In fact, I'm not a philosopher at all. So my comments are really more in the nature of questions rather than comments, rather than criticisms. So from the discussion, and part of the discussion that occurred both yesterday and in the paper that was the basis of yesterday's talk, part of the discussion is motivated or driven by the specific examples that he uses. So from that discussion, it is not clear whether the duty of justice is owed to a specific individual by other individuals, or whether it can also be owed to groups of individuals that are well specified. So do I, for example, only owe a duty of justice to some woman, Sarah, who may live 200 years from now, but perhaps also to other women like Sarah who are related to her or who are in the same, how should I say, same circumstantial position as her. And again, from the example, it was not clear that you owe the duty of justice only to Sarah and not also to other people like Sarah if you can specify them. And the reason I want to ask this question is because if I understand the duty of justice correctly, it is the duty not to do harm to specific other individuals. So I don't quite see why I do not have a duty of justice to groups of individuals that may be in a structurally alike position. So why do I not have a duty of justice which would not to practice ritual untouchability against Dalits in India? So would that not be a duty of justice? And do the Dalits in India, the untouchables in India, not have a right to expect me not to harm them by practicing untouchability? So if that is it's a question. I want to say that the answer is yes, I do have duties of justice also to groups. And if that is the case, then I don't understand why I don't have a duty of justice in relation to people like Sarah who might exist 100 or 200 years from now. So that's one question I wanted to raise about the example in particular that Professor Broom used. The second was about the duty of goodness, and the example there that Professor Broom uses is from Godwin, and it's about how the duty of goodness might require me, according to Godwin, to share what I have or give what I have to somebody else who may make better use of it. So that sounds absurd and it doesn't sound very practical, but what about a situation in which I have resources that I actually am not using and I'm not relying upon, and which somebody else can use much better or to much greater effect or for much greater benefit to themselves? So if I have $35 billion and I'm Warren Buffett, why would I not have a duty of goodness that would require me to share it with others? Because I'm never going to use it. My children, even if they did nothing and ate sitting on their chairs or lying in their beds the whole of their lives, would never use it up. So why does the duty of goodness not require me to use things that I do not have use for doing good in the world? And the third question I want to raise is about the relationship between particular acts or actions and how they connect or how they relate to the duty of goodness and justice. So for much of the exposition, Professor Broom draws a specific relationship, draws a one-to-one relationship between particular acts and whether they meet the obligations of the duty of goodness versus the obligations of the duty of justice. But there are many acts that we can imagine or that we can do that would simultaneously lead both to the fulfillment of the duty of justice and to the fulfillment of the duty obligations around the duty of goodness. In fact, in some ways, one could argue that when one is buying offsets, one is simultaneously doing both. One is providing resources that may benefit somebody, and one is also reducing harms. So if one does that, if one tries to undermine this distinction between the duty of justice and goodness and between public and private morality, what does that do to the different concrete proposals that Professor Broom considers or rejects or does not consider? And in fact, I think, so there are these three additional elements to his lecture that I want to focus on, the practical and concrete ones, and the two about offsets and compensation that I mentioned, and the one that I want to talk about, which he does not mention, around climate adaptation action. So offsets, if you recall, are actions that individuals can undertake to undo the harms that their emissions do to future generations. How do you offset? You pay somebody else to reduce emissions by the amount you have emitted. Or as Professor Nordhaus said, you do X in one dimension and minus X in another. Or you can also pay somebody to, in fact, prevent the emissions that you might have reduced by investing in or providing renewable energy. So the first of these, to reduce emissions by the amount that you emitted, can be done by, for example, planting trees and sinking the timber into deep ocean, the latter by paying for renewable energy that is not based on fossil fuel consumption. So although Professor Broom considers offsets as things that individuals can do to reduce harms, to meet their obligations towards the duty of justice, he doesn't see this as a solution to climate change, and in contrast suggests borrowing from future generations to compensate the current generation to reduce emissions is the solution to strive towards, if only economists can find a way to create institutions that can credibly issue debt against the future prosperity of future generations. Now, I'm not quite sure whether this can be done, and to tell you the truth, I felt very glad. I've never felt particularly about well or badly about whether I'm an economist or not, but last evening I felt glad I was not an economist because I didn't have to invent these institutions, but perhaps they can be invented. Nonetheless, I think the argument requires a little bit of unpacking, particularly this argument of why offsetting is not a solution both for the private and for the public actions that would be required both by private and public morality. I want to ask how it is that a moral prescription of individuals, even if they all follow it, cannot be a solution for the collective, and also how is borrowing from the future generations a solution when we, in fact, depending on the way climate change unfolds, don't know what the level of their prosperity would be. So let's take the first option, which is offsetting by planting trees. So for about a half, and I'm doing very rough back of the envelope calculations, there are 500 million people, let's say, who are rich, 10%, top 10% of the global population. Offsetting their emissions, assuming they each emit about 10 tons of carbon, would require planting enough trees to suck up their emissions as these trees grow. Let's say total emissions for this group would be about 5 billion tons at 10 tons per person. Each hectare of land, if you plant it with trees, about 100 to 150 trees per hectare, can suck up about 2 tons of carbon on an ongoing basis. So you plant the trees, they survive, they'll keep taking in about 2 tons of carbon per year, per hectare. So we'll need to plant about 2.5 billion hectares of land with trees for all harm-producing persons to be able to offset their emissions. So, we have already said that everybody is morally required to buy offsets. So the only thing that we are considering is whether if everybody, in fact, follows that moral injunction, can that be a solution at the collective level? Or can that be a solution to climate change? And I'm not talking about feasibility, okay? Although we can consider the feasibility of this option versus the option of issuing debt against the prosperity of future generations. So currently, total area of forests on the planet is about 4 billion hectares, about 27% of the planet's surface. So essentially, it means we'll need it means that we will need to raise the total area under trees to about 40 to 42%. And that would be sufficient number of trees and sufficient area of forests to continue to suck up carbon that we are currently emitting and solve the collective problem. Now, I don't deny that to plant a sufficiently large area with trees is a gargantuan task, and one would need to also think about what are the alternative land uses to which this land is currently being put, especially because right now we have net deforestation, about 30 million hectares every year, and now we are talking about planting 2.5 billion hectares with new trees. These are big ifs. But the nice things about this solution is that once you have done this, they will continue to suck up carbon and carbon dioxide from the atmosphere for the lifetime of the trees. And then you can cut them up, put them in the deep ocean, and plant the same area with new trees. So this is a sustainable solution at one level once you address the issues of feasibility. And another thing about this solution is that unlike many, probably every geoengineering proposal, it is something 45% of the planet under trees is something that the planet and humans have experienced in their past. It is not something that we would need to fear will upset the carbon cycle or the nitrogen cycle or create things that we cannot anticipate what they would do to the climate or to the planet. But this is not an option that Professor Broom considered. At one level, it's almost too mundane, right? It's almost too sort of simple. At least intellectually, it seems just too simple. You know, just keep planting trees. What's the intellectual challenge there? As far as the second method of offsetting is concerned, if which is, remember, investing in renewable energy technologies or using renewable energy so that you are not producing fossil fuel-based emissions. So as far as the second method of offsetting is concerned, if each harm-producing person were to attend to the amount of offsets. So again, what the thing that I'm trying to figure out is what is the reason, or where is the disjunction between the private actions of the individuals who are seeking to buy offsets and the collective solution to the problem of climate change. So the feasibility issues I'm putting aside for the moment. And the reason I'm considering this is because I want to understand better why it is that offsets cannot be a solution at the collective level to the problem of climate change. So as far as the second method of offsetting is concerned, the idea is that we would buy offsets that would reduce emissions by increasing the amount of renewable energy, renewable sources-based energy. And now if everybody did this, so just imagine there's 500 million people seeking offsets through renewable energy production, presumably this would lead to a major transformation in the cost and efficiency of renewable energy production. So solar energy right now is about 1.5 times as expensive as energy produced from oil. It is somewhat more expensive than that produced from gas because of substantial increases in gas output right now. But the costs of solar energy have been going down. They used to be 3 times the costs of conventional energy solutions. And solar energy still is only about less than, I don't remember the exact figures, but it's less than 1% of total energy production. And for most innovations, for most new technologies, the costs of technologies undergo a substantial reduction when the technology becomes widespread or when it is used. And you can trace the cost structure of all sorts of technologies. At the point where they are adopted by 20 to 30% of the population, the costs become less than a third of what they used to be when they were being used only by a quarter of or 0.5% of the population. So I would imagine that if there's such a large number of people buying offsets based on renewable energy, there'd be a massive increase in demand and presumably a transformation in the cost structure and the efficiency of renewable energy production. And a massive increase in renewable energy production driven by demands from moral individuals who wish to reduce their harms and increase the amount of good in the world seems to me to be a very good thing. So once again, I am not quite sure why this is not also a solution at the collective level. So I would argue that, so I would argue that collapsing the distinctions between private and public morality, in fact, leads you towards two solutions that Professor Broom himself mentions only as a private option, but which he rejects as a collective solution. The second proposal, about which he thinks can be more, which he thinks can address the collective problem of climate change, is the one that talks about compensation. So again, I'm not going to go into the business as usual compensation optimal solutions that he talked about, because both Professor Nordhaus and he already talked about it. But the proposal is very straightforward, and it is based essentially on the observed lack of movement, one might even say failure of negotiations over reduction of emissions of the emissions that are responsible for climate change, the failure of negotiations in different international fora. And this failure is owing to the fact that governments are being asked to make sacrifices, and they in turn must ask their citizens to make sacrifices. Nobody likes to make a sacrifice, not even Donald Trump, not even Americans. So instead, why not reward people for reducing emissions? Where will the resources for this come from? By issuing debt against future generations. And this solution reminds me of a different story, which is about two friends who had only a little bit to eat. One of them had 2 loaves of bread, and the other had 3 loaves of bread. And they're both hungry. But they met a beggar who was even hungrier and even more emaciated and even more tired and exhausted looking than them. And he asked them for food. So they thought about what they're going to do, and they decided, well, one has 3 loaves, one has 2 loaves. There are 3 people. They're going to divide up the 5 loaves of bread into 15 pieces, and each of them will have 5 pieces, 5 pieces of bread. So they did that, and they ate the bread. After they had finished eating, the beggar thanked them and revealed that he was in fact not a beggar. He was Lord Vishnu. And Lord Vishnu had come on the earth to figure out whether there were still people who were generous in this world, and he had posed this entreaty for giving him food to them as a test. And they had both passed the test, so Vishnu was very happy, and he gave them 10 gold coins, 2 gold coins for each piece of bread that they had shared with him. And then he disappeared, presumably to rest after all his exertions trying to find generosity in this world. Of course, the question that the 2 friends now had to answer was, and which you might try your hand at answering, is how should they distribute these 10 pieces of gold or 10 gold coins that Vishnu gave the 2 friends? So one friend said, well, I had 3 loaves of bread and you had 2, so why don't I keep 6 coins and you keep 4? The other one said, listen, we both were equal in our sentiments about sharing the food that we had. We should divide up this, these 10 pieces of gold, 5 and 5, half and half, because we both. And so they had a long argument about this. And then they met a wise man who said, who they felt could answer their question. He was not a political scientist. And so this person heard the whole story, and he said, so you had 3 loaves of bread, you had 2 loaves of bread, he gave you 10. Well, I think the person who had 3 loaves of bread, he should get 8 pieces of gold. And the person who had 2 loaves of bread should get only 2 pieces. And the guy was really unhappy. Wait a second. I mean, the choice was really between either me getting 5 pieces or me getting 4 pieces. How do you come to 2 pieces? And I said, well, think about it this way. You had 2 loaves of bread, and you divided it up into 6 pieces. And your friend had 3 loaves of bread, and he divided it up into 9 pieces. And then he gave 4 pieces to Vishnu, and you gave 1 piece to Vishnu, so you actually ate 5 of your pieces. You only gave 1, so you should get only 2 coins, and the guy who gave 4 pieces should get 8 coins. So there are many different moralities, but the story or the proposal to borrow from future generations about whose levels of prosperity if climate change is a reality, and this whole argument is turning on the idea that climate change will unfold with various kinds of consequences that we cannot, in fact, even pin down with any level of certainty. So if we, in fact, reach 550 or 650 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and current indications are that's exactly where we are going to get. In fact, that's not going to be the end point. That's likely to be just a way station on whatever point we are going to get. We don't know what the effects of this are going to be. We know that they're not going to be very good. They might be, as Professor Nordhaus said, and as some climate scientists would say, they might be no more than loss of 1 to 2 to 3 percentage points in GDP going forward per year. They might be much more. Some people have called climate change the greatest, not just environmental, but just existential challenge for humanity. Not everybody agrees, I concede. So to ask somebody that in fact cannot express their preferences on the assumption that they are going to be more prosperous than we are, may in fact be okay, because in fact they are going to be more prosperous than we are. But I don't know that there is any certainty around that. And so the proposal seems to me at one level to be perfectly in accord with the conceptual architecture that Professor Broom lays down. But at another level, it seems to me not derivable from moral philosophy, from moral positions, that given the huge amounts of uncertainty in what is likely to happen, we should not be asking people who cannot express an opinion and who cannot give their consent to pay us for what we are doing. But I also, at the end, I also want to ask a third question, which is that in talking about private and public morality in the context of climate change and climate action, Professor Broom's lecture focuses on mitigation, which is how to reduce emissions. And I think, there are a whole slew of other kinds of actions around which one might also want to think what moral philosophy would tell us. And so this may seem like calling for Professor Broom to do something that he did not do in the paper. And that's not that's not the point I'm trying to make. The question I want to ask is, would Professor Broom have focused on, and he's here so he can answer that question, would he have focused on a different kind of climate action were the world to be a different kind of place than what we are living in right now? And so what is this different kind of world that I'm imagining? So imagine a world in which climate negotiations have failed, and you might say, well, we live in that. But imagine one in which they have failed conclusively. And we are now at a point where you have atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration levels of 550 or 600 parts per million. In that world, if you were to pick a question, and I understand that that's not the world that we are in, but I think there is every likelihood that that's the world we are going to get to. In that world, would it be necessary and important to think about the public and private, or the morality of how to deal with adaptation? And what are the obligations of individuals when they are thinking about adaptation? Again, all the structure of the disparities and the structures of asymmetries remain almost exactly the same, which is that the people who will suffer the most from those harms are not the ones who have contributed the most, right? And they are ones over whom we have no right to continue to exert harms. But the difference is that the contributions we make towards the happiness or towards the goodness and the justice, towards the obligations that the duty of justice and goodness enjoin upon us would be the same. The contributions we make would both reduce the harms that people are suffering because people would suffer because of impacts of climate change, and they would increase or advance the amount of goodness through the effects they will have on what those people could do. Thank you very much.